The Civil War killed around 620,000 Americans. The war contradicted the name United States of America, as surely America's states were not united at the time. So many lives were lost during the Civil War in order to establish a more perfect union. How many of those were black?
The Civil War was mainly fought over slavery. America was split into two sides. The South believed that owning another human and forcing him or her to work without pay, and often against their will, was acceptable. The North believed otherwise. For the slaves, the work was hard, the treatment and food was bad, and on plantations with harsher masters, the slaves were whipped for how fast they worked. But with the Civil War came a change in routine and discipline for the slaves.
The beginning of the Civil War marked a change in everyone's lives. Slave owners went off to war, and as a result, the plantations became disorganized, and there was an outbreak of runaway slaves. Surprisingly, many slaves were very enthusiastic about fighting in the war for the South. Here, the greatest mistake was made because the President of the South, Jefferson Davis, would not allow black men to fight. He said it would lower the morale of the white soldiers and also give a bad impression to the North. Instead, he gave the blacks the job of supplying and supporting the South with menial jobs.
At first, slaveholders had brought their slaves along to help with the cooking and laundry. But when several slaves ran off and gave the North information about Southern troop placement, they were soon kept under closer watch. The slaves mainly had to dig trenches, carry supplies, and basically do all the hard work. Due to the tiresome work and horrible food, the slaves usually returned home in poor physical condition. This discouraged Southern slaveholders and stopped them from sending their slaves to war. After a while, it was obvious that the North was winning the war, and this caused Jefferson Davis to rethink his decision.
The North was beginning to win the Civil War, and it had been expected because they had so many more soldiers than the South. Now people in the South were beginning to question whether it really was a good idea not to let the slaves fight. Finally, slaves were granted the ability to wield a weapon and fight alongside the white soldiers of the South. Although many say that this was still not enough, black soldiers were, as some put it, on the battlefield purely for show. One thing that stands out is that in the Union Army, they actually treated their black soldiers worse than the white treated theirs. Black soldiers in the South were paid as much as white privates. In the Union, however, the blacks were paid less. In fact, many black people living in the South really wanted to fight, for reasons such as maintaining freedom, land, and pride, and so they would give their lives to fight for it. Although it was vital to let the black people fight, alas, it was too late for the South.
At the plantations, the slaves were being forced to go and work in the factories and mines, due to the absence of the people who usually worked there. The work was so bad that several more slaves left, and although the majority of the slaves decided to stay on their plantations, their work rate decreased severely. Since they were fighting the North, the South did not have anyone to sell cotton to, so the plantations began growing food and livestock. Because of this, there was even less food for the slaves, and they were living off whatever they could catch or farm. This all led up to more and more slaves running off to the North, which in turn meant that even if the South miraculously managed to turn the war around and win it, their whole reason for fighting the war will probably have run off to the North.